Good afternoon, and thank you. Thank you, Rasil. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you for your members of your family. I'm sorry we're missing Mrs. Kiran Gujral. It would have been wonderful to be able to greet her on this day. In Memoriam suggests a certain sadness because of the passing of Satish Gujral in 2020, I think in the month of March. But it's also a moment of great celebration for, I think, what would have been one of the most important artistic reputations that spanned over 50 or 70 years. My own acquaintance with Satish Gujral would have been tracing back to, I think, 1982 or so, when he had an exhibition of his burnt wood works in the Sri Dharani Gallery. It was a stunning show. It was stunning because of the totemic power of the work, the authority, the vigor, the almost the brute force that he was able to pour into the sculpting of these works. And I was a young journalist at that point, and that was my first interview. And over the next, I think, 35 years or so, there were periodic interviews in their home, in the Gujral's home in Lajpat Nagar, over coffee, tea, pistas, which we used to somehow get. And there was a way that we worked. Very often, Mrs. Gujral would be the interlocutor, but often I'd write the questions and he would respond. And I think this may be the appropriate time to thank him and to thank the family and to thank Kiran Gujral for the generosity that they showed towards a much younger person of no consequence, and the welcome and the warmth of their home. Now, every art form, how do we read? I think the important thing to do with Satish Gujral is to understand his monumentality as an artist. And I'm using these words consciously. Every art form has a solitary tower. Amir Khan in the realm of music was called a lonely tower. Satish Gujral was certainly a solitary tower. He was not absorbed into any of the schools of art which were sort of, laid into some kind of template in the 1940s, whether it was the Delhi Shilpi Chakra or whether it was the progressives. He had been, after all, a part of the JJ school. He showed with them in a few exhibitions, but he was never absorbed into them, just as Amir Khan was never completely absorbed into the Gharana system. Next, please. His career spanned over about 70 years. And my address today will look at three aspects of his practice. One is the very impressive body of work which have their unparalleled position in a certain sense in Asian art, South Asian art, and that is the partition paintings. The second is his gifts as a polymath. Where do they trace from? And the first and the third, maybe, which we can certainly speculate on, is his place in the canon of Indian modernism. The photograph that you will see after this, the next one, please. Next, please. Bhai Sahab, next, please. This photograph probably traces to 1952. Satish Gujral is in Mexico, and there is the quickening, so to speak, of the creative temper, the creative energies. But his maturation as an artist has already taken place at the age of 22 during the Holocaust months of partition. Next, please. He produces on his return between Delhi and Simla these kinds of works which he calls the Partition Drawings. And this is a very blown up image, but what you will see, and I hope anybody who follows Satish Gujral will see what is the intimate relationship between these works and the works that come later. These great flowing lines, the saturation of dark colors, the keening, the mourning, the figure in, she's just filling the frame, she's pushing almost out of the frame. The melancholia is so overwhelming. And then the repetition of the other figures behind her. So if we are to understand Satish Gujral, we have to understand that the root cause of his modernity, of his inchoate growth as an artist, really lies in his experience in partition, of which I will talk a little later. How do we place him in the ground of Indian modernism? In 1947, when the country is independent, the institutions like the Lalit Kala, the National Gallery of Modern Art, are still to be born. the field is like an empty cartographic space. And how do the modernists occupy it? We know that Raza goes to Paris. Next, please. I will just show you another of the partition drawings. Raza goes to Paris. Hussein embraces farmers, zameen, the simplicity of those on the cusp of the rural. Sousa challenges Christian theology with his vigorous attacks on religious imagery. Gujral looks at the immediate highly located works within the Punjab, the division of Punjab, his experience of ferrying people across the border when there was the great distress of partition, what he saw of bringing across refugee families on the way there and on the way back. And I have to say that while many Punjabis, there has been a lot of writing on this by scholars like and journalists like Dhiren Bhagat, that while most Punjabis buried this neurosis, the terrible trauma of partition, I know my own family was part of this Holocaust. They buried the trauma of this event. Satish Gujral spoke about it. He never let it go. It became a part of his identity, his Punjabiyat, his almost his confrontationist attitude to what the world had thrown at him and what he was going to throw back in terms of his creative expression. Now, seeing these works when he produces them as a young man of 22, next please. Look at this. Look at the authority that we are able to see, and this is, I think, also dated in the file that Rasil gave me to 1948. So seeing this work, Kapila Vatsyan and the poet Agye, her husband, and they were a great power couple in Delhi, they organized an exhibition for him at the Masonic Lodge. And who should inaugurate it but the Education Minister, Humayun Kabir. Now, at this event, the influential art critic, Charles Fabry, who everybody admires and reads even today, the critic of the Statesman, made this wonderful heraldic statement. He said, the word genius, and I'm quoting, the word genius has rarely been used in these columns, but it is the correct term for Satish Gujral. Wow, what a hurrah for a 22-year-old man. At the time, the poet Octavio Paz was also ambassador of Mexico in India. He's also impressed with this creative output, and Gujral is then sent to Mexico. In one of the interviews that we did, he spoke of how difficult it was even to order a cup of coffee in Mexico. There is no common language. He's a man who cannot communicate, or he cannot hear, though he can certainly communicate through writing or through speaking, but they didn't know English. Oh dear. Okay. Abhi chalega? Yeah. A breakdown. Should I continue speaking? मैं बात करती चलती हूँ. Okay, so between 1952 and 1954, Satish Gujral is in Mexico. And we also know that at this time, there are Sousa, Raza, etc. have migrated. They have gone to the West. There are a number of scholarships which are given to young Indian artists under the John D. Rockefeller grant. But their movement, their trajectory, their inspirations, and even the language that they're trying to develop is entirely American or American abstraction or the School of Paris. Satish Gujral sets out on a completely solitary path. And that is really, I think, the beginning of any kind of, we think of cooperation among artists in the global south in the 1990s. No, it happens in the 1950s when he lands up over there. The next one, please. Look at this picture, Diego Rivera and Satish Gujral. By the time he is in Paris, the trinity of Siqueiros, Orozco, and Rivera are already, I mean, they are the monumental figures of among the Mexican muralists. And apart from being muralists, they're also the cultural icons of much of South America. They are able to absorb him into the fold. He works in the atelier of Siqueiros. He absorbs a lot of the kind of stylistic energy, the kind of way that they were able to paint their vast murals across much of Mexico City, as well as under commissions in New York. He learns the art of painting with acrylic, and that is what he then brings back to India. Now, the mural was a form of social communication. It is a very third world, or very underdeveloped in a certain sense, where you put out a statement, a nationalist statement, but in a way that the entire world passes by and absorbs it and is able to understand what he is saying. He was, Orozco and Siqueiros and Diego Rivera were influenced by El Greco, Goya, German Expressionism. I want to show you the next slide, please. This is the kind of work that then starts to come out from Satish Gujral when he is in Mexico. And look at the way there is a sort of a balance between abstraction but also the human figure. Next, please. The idea of borders, definitions, a certain degree of violence, and the mutilation of the human body. Next, please. I wanted to show this to you because this would be the kind of art that Satish Gujral would have become familiar with across the public buildings of Mexico. Of course, this is in New York. The heroic figure, a figure of resistance, the symbolic presence of these animal forms, and the resistance of man. Look at the next work, please. This is a very important painting by Orozco. This is the figure of Melinche, the woman in Mexico who was believed to have betrayed her nation. And we'll see what does Gujral also do then with the nude figure in moments of great war. This is a theme, the environment that Mexico for him would have represented a continuous area of a certain adrenaline rush and a certain degree of and a certain sense of the eventuality of great public movements. You've had the Mexican Revolution about 10 years before. After this, there is Cuba, very close to when he is there. And after that, there is Nicaragua. So the whole of South America is throbbing with the idea of social change. Gujral warms up to this. He's been in Punjab. He's seen the most violent kind of apocalyptic movement between two countries. There are other concerns in Mexico. One is the resistance to industrialization, as you can see over here. Whether it's good, whether it's bad, these debates were already happening in India. The other is the concern around the farmer and issues of agriculture. Gujral comes from the great granaries of North India, the Punjab, and he would respond to this. So these, in a sense, are not alienating, as the West might have been, as America in 1952 might have been to a young Indian painter. What do you do apart from walking the streets of New York? Here he was absorbed into the homes. We see we haven't carried it today because the picture quality is not so good, but there is Gujral with Diego Rivera, Gujral with Frida Kahlo in their home, and with great empathy, mutual empathy. If there is a bodily issue, there are bodily concerns that Frida Kahlo has, and this is towards the end of her life. There is young Satish Gujral with whom there is enormous empathy. In the next one, please. And this is his immediate, where he's working with Siqueiros. Siqueiros is ideologically a very strong, committed kind of thinker within the Mexican framework. And if you look at the sweep, the flow of musculature, the way the bodies are represented, there is a dismemberment of the limbs, there is the merging of the body with the machine. This is something that Satish Gujral has, as we will see, great mastery over. He has a much smaller scale. After all, he's working in a canvas which may be 4x4. He doesn't have access to these kinds of great spaces that are provided by the Mexican government to the Great Trinity. But what he does have in remarkable, and it's not even an echo because his work is already started like that, is this great dynamism and the energy that he brings. So what he makes of these influences of Mexico and Europe into Mexico is something that we see when he has an exhibition of 25 paintings at the Galerie de Art Moderna in Mexico. He's about to leave, and in a joint letter, Siqueiros and Rivera say to him The sojourn and practice of Satish Gujral, and I'm quoting, will facilitate the revival of mural painting, the people's art of India. And I think Satish Gujral would have thought like that on the ship back home of creating a people's art. And as we see, even late into the early 2000s, etc., there is this deep engagement within working within the public spaces. On his return to India via London, he exhibits in the city. And he gets a fantastic response in papers like The Spectator, the critics, etc., hail him. John Berger, the highly influential critic, says of Satish Gujral, he is as single-minded as Picasso. His exhibition should provoke, both humanly and artistically, as many people as possible. Next, please. So this is some of the body of works that he would have shown in Mexico and in England before coming back to India. Next, please. The theme of partition is something that he would use, you know, the tortured entities, the figures who are unable to reconcile. So when we look at his figures that he will continue to draw of migration, etc., there is a sort of a continuum. If you see, we'll just show you some drawings which continue from 1947 to 2002. So it's a very continuing preoccupation. Next, please. It's a self-portrait, Satish Gujral, and this churning, highly expressionistic backdrop that he gives. On his return to India, Gujral was to join the Delhi Shilpi Chakra, comprising a body of artists from his Lahore days, whom he knows. They are all migrants. Bhabesh Sanyal, S.L. Parashar, Prannath Mago. These are his friends. They would be at least familiar with Punjabi. They would be familiar with the expression of partition. Delhi Shilpi Chakra has a process of going out and setting up exhibitions even in public parks. It allows you to buy art on, on consignment for a few rupees a month. None of this can support an artist, but Gujral becomes a part of it quite wholeheartedly. Next, please. See, these are the drawings that the vendor. And this is really, if you speak to a number of the artists today, young artists like Atul Bhalla, etc., who speak about the families that come across, they got houses which were 54 square feet or something. They all slept outside. And these were how the refugee families were absorbed. Next, please. This is it, the mark before suicide, a very painful memory of something that was to be experienced by those who couldn't find a way to survive. Next, please. Another self-portrait, 1953. And this slow submergence into abstraction, this is something that we notice, and then again he brings back the figure from time to time. Next, please. So the most influential event in his life when he returns is his marriage to Kiran Gujral in 1957. This may be a slightly later picture, but I found it so attractive because it has a gallery, it has his wife, it has her in a supportive role, there are his paintings, and obviously an exhibition is being planned. Rasil told me that they had a reception that was, I think, attended by Pandit Nehru, and that would have been certainly red letter day in their lives. Next, please. This is also a period of the portrait. There is a subduing of the violent energies of the earlier works, but his father, whom he was greatly influenced by, who had a strong Gandhian propensity, and he does this particular portrait of his father. Next, please. And their friend Uma Vasudev, who, they thought she was very much a part of the cultural scene, but the way the body is moving into abstraction it's perfectly poised in 1959 for the kind of work that Satish Gujral will now do. You have the portrait, and then you have this flow into a certain kind of an indeterminacy. Next, please. Young Satish Gujral, 1940. Why is it coming here so late? I think there is in Satish Gujral a cyclical attitude towards work. And what we see earlier of his, of the way he puts together the response, the passionate response of partition, and then a little later, the more distributive response of some of his work. He's only about 15 years old. And we know from the biographical detail that he's gone through enormous privation as a young boy in the Jhelum River when he had gone for a swim with his elder brother. His foot had got stuck between two big rocks. It had been irreparably damaged. The treatment that he received was not effective. He damaged his leg, and then he also permanently damaged his hearing. This was the young Satish Gujral, who would have been also in the Mayo School of Arts. The Mayo School of Arts has been set up in 1870 as a British school, and while the Mayo School in, say, Calcutta or Chennai were much more oriented towards the Bhadralok or the better families, the ones that he would have been going to school with were literally the artisanal sons. The food he thought was absolutely terrible. He had a really hard time. But he learnt, and by sheer grit, the kinds of things he would have learnt was carpentry, wood carving, the making of designs. The scale of the number of things that he was exposed to was tremendous. And as we go along, we realize that slowly they all come into play in his practice. Next, please. These are the early years. I'll show you two paintings which are sort of popped up a little early. These are the early 1960s. But there is something in Satish Gujral which is not what you usually find in an artist. And that is what we more and more call intermediality, that you can move from a medium to a medium, but use you can use the character of one to come into the other. So if you look at the paintings over here, you look at this kind of work that he's doing, the textures that he's giving. Next, please. And this, not in the best of shape in terms of how the paint has held up over these last, 60 years, but still there is the broad movement toward abstraction is very profound. Next, please. I just want to show you these two works which are, we realize that this is where Gujral had also located himself socially and in terms of his sympathies. Next, please. Very important picture of Satish Gujral with Pandit Nehru and his brother Inder Gujral, who becomes Prime Minister, taken in Teen Murti House. This is probably the high point of modern India's collaboration with the artist. Indira Gandhi has been to Shanti Niketan. There are paintings being accepted for Parliament House. We know that Nandalal Bose was given the great, Nandalal Bose was given the great commission for, putting in the work in the constitution, the decorative elements. The artists had worked with Gandhi, etc., on the Congress pandals for their great meetings. But here, the Prime Minister has access to the artist. The artist can sit and draw and paint his portrait over a long period of time. So this is a very important, perhaps, point in the career of Satish Gujral, this access to power. Next, please. So having now settled into Delhi, he has, I think, a certain efflorescence. There is something very charming about his collages because there is a certain joyousness. This is 10 years into his marriage. There would be babies, there would be domesticity, there would be life that is justifies these kinds of colors, this kind of vibrancy. Next, please. Here, mother and child. This is straight coming from the home. But there is also a resistance to representation, which he could so easily do because he was also a portraitist. But he gives it this. And Satish Gujral often spoke about the fact that whenever he was getting very immersed into one kind of medium, he'd make a switch. So how does he then go from the partition paintings to portraiture? There are other political portraits as well, Krishna Menon, for instance, the foreign minister, and then slip straight into the collage. And these are among some of his most, some of the happiest works that he ever made. Next, please. Then the Diego Rivera's prognosis that Satish Gujral will go back and revive the great mural tradition of India. I mean, you may have had frescoes in Ajanta and Ellora, but the building of India in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, the great, the offices of Air India, where artists were commissioned, or hotels like the Oberoi in Delhi had a lovely Satish Gujral, a mural for a very long time. So these kinds of ceramic murals were the ones that were coming up. Diego Rivera had seen education as fusing together a national workshop that fused the fine arts and crafts. And what is so important about Satish Gujral is that you cannot see this as Mexican or Indian or Western. He's able to fuse sensibilities. There is a cultural ethos which he arrives at with no self-consciousness about, is this indigenous, is this Western, which was all the terrible debates that Indian artists had to endure for a long time. Next, please. Yeah, this is the mural in Chandigarh Museum. And look at the totemic kind of forms. Totemic kind of forms that we can see that, they have a timeless quality. They're not really, Chandigarh is a brand new city, but Gujral chooses to give it a kind of timelessness. If it's a figure of a man and a woman, there's a stillness, there's a heaviness, and they are occupying the mural with a kind of, depth and intensity, which is really for all time. Next, please. At the High Court. I have to now bring in another element, and that is wondering, how did they work? Delhi in the 1950s, early 1960s would have been extremely inhospitable to the artist. The Lalit Kala studios in Garhi were not there. Artists didn't have a lot of money. There were no grants. I mean, Lalit Kala has come up, but there are still not many grants that artists can survive with. So in the course of this presentation, I asked Rasil, what were your father's working spaces like? And she sent me this. She shot me this back from her car because it must have been something that was so immediate for her. She said that when her parents married, Pandit Nehru bestowed his patronage by allotting them a pied-à-terre in the old barracks of Constitution House. Here their home and their studio was one. So Kiran Gujral, who is a ceramist of distinction, and Satish Gujral actually have one space, which is a tiny space. In 1962, they were allotted a better C-class accommodation in Tilak Marg's government colony, a ground floor house apartment with a front and a back garden. The garage of this house, as well as the staff area, became a studio for my father. He worked there, and after school, either as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. That was the age when she was there. I sat on an oil drum and mixed pigments and watched him paint. The rear studio for my father and mother was for mixed work. This is interesting, that their house was like a laboratory of experimentation, where they were both following a shared as well as different paths. Batik, acrylic, molded objects, wooden murals, furniture, all going on at the same time in whatever space they could find. She also says of her parents' studio, which is, I thought, very charming. There was a demarcation of studio space, but no division. As he sketched, drew, dreamt, and gave interviews all in the same space. And when he starts to work on these ceramics, because of the detailing, I imagine, he then moves to his own studio in Okhla. Next, please. And now we see the great expansion into scale. There is a sort of the monument with seams and the paintings and the drawings, etc. We just see this, we look at this metal and ceramic mural in Riyadh. I'm not sure where it is. We didn't have that information. But it's, this is the kind of monumentality that Gujral can swing between. He can swing between media, materials, monumentality, the influences of the miniature. And in that sense, he's a genuine, natural polymath. Next, please. The burnt woods. This is what he starts in 1972, and I have met him 10 years later, where the intensity of the burnt wood in terms of its, in terms of the way the blowtorch is used on the wood has become even more marked. These come up in the 1970s. Next, please. These are, next, please. These are sort of like, these are the metal works which he has which I think many of you who would have that memory would recall, works like this were in the entrance of the NGMA. He's pushed even further into abstraction, and you'll see that there is a sort of a movement from the terracotta murals to the later burnt wood works. Next, please. Here the materials, we have to try to also understand what is the context. Were there other artists working in metal in this way? Was this the kind of language that had been appropriated? During the 1970s, India goes through what was called the tantric phase of a certain inspiration in modern Indian art. Satish Gujral turns it on its head and brings out these very contemporary looking metal works which may have had a tantric inspiration, but they stand completely alone because there was nothing quite like them. Next, please. And then these drawings, which I think are phenomenal. He says he's described the inspiration as the Panchatantra, but then the man animal, the beast and the human, its propensity, its shared space, its proximity, its archaic nature that he excavates, when he's making these kinds of drawings is quite remarkable. Really very powerful drawings. Next, please. Yeah. And the burnt wood, which I am continue to be so taken with. So this is dedicated to the unknown soldier, and there is another work. How do we read these works? Do we see these as, how much time? 15 minutes, oh great. So, I mean, what are is it totemic? Are the beads, the strings, the elements that decorate them, are they meant to suggest a certain antiquity? Is the blowtorch meant to be, that has darkened the wood, is it meant to be a mark of, a resultant rage, a sort of a nihilistic approach to the artwork? What was he intending? And the sensuality, the desire to allow the work, its molding, its curves, to speak very directly to the viewer. These are all, this is probably, I think, one of Gujral's most enduring series of works which carries on, I think, at least for the next 10 years. Next, please. So the anthropomorphic forms that we see in the drawings also convert very comfortably into this, the birth of Ganesh, where I don't think the detail or the representation of the actual birth of Ganesh is of any importance to him in a lasting sense. It is much more the effect that he can draw from the lines, the play of shadow, and the ritual element that he is able to embed by the use of red, gold, and black, which places them within the broad sphere of tantric art. In that sense, and he does this seemingly, with no self-consciousness. There's no anxiety around the breadth of the work that he produces. Next, please. I wanted to show how these carry on into drawings which come even later, and how there is in Satish Gujral a greater tendency towards a certain lyricism. There has been a lot of commentary on how he sought an inner music. The art of silence is what you have called your project and your exhibition around him. But can we not hypothesize that the flow of the lines, the curvature that he lends to the figures, the inner rhythm was very deeply personal. It was something that he heard. And as we say that you see with your mind, and he certainly heard from within. And this is what Satish Gujral was able, this was really his gift to himself, this sense of this internal rhythm that flowed through so much of his art. Next, please. And these I'm showing you, I thought these drawings were so well executed, and they are preparatory to the paintings that he was also to make. Next, please. During the later phase of his work, there is the 2018s, etc. The man, the machine, the animal, the melding and the forging of bodies and their separation, sport. These were some of the subjects that he played with, and we see that he has probably moved very, very substantially away from the turmoil of the past 50 years, or what was certainly in the period up till about the mid-1950s, the intensely felt work. The line has become acquiescent, it is gentler, it is more settled. It's a deeply settled practice by now. It's a practice of acceptance. Next, please. And this is one of the paintings that we are showing from this period. And subject of contemplation, rest, thoughtfulness, reverie, or dream that he's able to bring to his work. Next, please. These are some of the metal sculptures which result at this time. Liberty, he does a lot of work on the idea of liberty, and then the tribal. Here you can see this work. It's executed with the same principles that he brings to his drawings, of a sense of just the sheer sensuosity of the material is so beautifully conveyed. Next, please. There has been speculation about the subject of primitivism in Satish Gujral. Would this not apply to his burnt woods, to his sculptures such as these, to the work that he pushes, beyond his metropolitan existence into spheres of which defy the temporal, which defy the immediate? And this is the kind of work, I think he turned to it for its intense drama, for its inherent theatricality, and for its, we might say, the timelessness that he seems to seek in much of his work. Next, please. And this is what we will end with. These are the Satish Gujral's great gifts to all time, in a certain sense, and that was his architectural practice. One of the notes that Rasil shared was about that when the architectural practice really starts, initially it's the dining table in the home, which becomes like the space for receiving multiple drawings, and becomes a sort of an atelier for people to work. He's worked with metal, he's worked with glass, he's worked with every kind of industrial as well as natural form. It's interesting that he turns to terracotta. And the work is, if you notice, it has this open-faced kind of character. It's like an embrace. It's as if the building has its arms wide out. And this is the Belgian embassy in the Chancery. It's quite a remarkable building. How does Satish Gujral, is it surely the memory of what he learnt at the Mayo School in terms of the interdependency of the arts is not so enduring? You can perhaps look at it as his own, what in Hindi would be called parakram. The ability to innovate, the ability to excavate what you have not known, to try to find within yourself that depth. He wasn't a trained architect, and yet he could produce work like this. Next, please. This is another view of this remarkable building. And the throwback to an earlier architecture of Delhi. And Delhi has been called many things. It's been called the necropolis of the Lodhis and the Mughals, but it is a city rich in the residue of architectural work from the 12th, 13th century onwards. And Gujral then goes back to a period whereby this is sort of the enduring nature of the materials and the shapes and the forms is there. Next, please. A farmhouse project in Saudi Arabia, where again the chroma, the materials, seem to suit the landscape. They seem to be sui generis, as if having come out of the land, not an imposition. Next, please. Computer Maintenance Corporation, Hyderabad. It's interesting that they wanted something that looked from another time, being a computer company. Next, please. And I think this is the last slide. It's certainly one of the most magnificent works. The Bhimrao Ambedkar Samajak Parivartan Sthal in Lucknow. It's a monument, I think, and I think Gujral gets this perfectly. He understands not only the need for a certain monumentality, but the need to allocate space to those to whom it has been denied, to the Dalit Samaj, to give them spaces which are welcoming, which are magnificent, and comparative to the grandest architecture that the land has produced. And this, in this sense, this ability of the grand gesture, of executing something that is beyond the imagination in many ways. I'm interested in the way you could write another essay on something like the use of the symbol. But in Gujral, this happens. So here you see elements of Sanchi, you see elements of the appropriation of the elephant, which is very much a part of the Dalit Samaj parties, but also from a much more ancient tradition, which is about the 2nd century, where the elephant is then appropriated into the idea of the regnal in Indian history. And of course, the dome, which is, and I think what is important in Gujral is the syncretism of being a man who came from an undivided Punjab, who wore his Punjabiyat on his sleeve with such intent. It was so much a part of his personality that you couldn't help but respond as a fellow Punjabi. You couldn't help but see that this was at the core of his identity. And this syncretism of the marrying of cultures is so ingrained that you don't need to pull up all the elements. To do that would be to do an injustice to the man. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I'm really grateful that I could do this. I think Satish Gujral passed away when we couldn't say goodbye. But he would have loved a laugh. He would have loved a moment to share an Urdu couplet. He would have told you how to write. He would have given you a lot of instructions. And in my growing years of a period of about 25 or 30 years, like Krishan Khanna, Satish Gujral was a figure that I often spoke to. He was a guiding figure. He was a man of such exceptional talent that I don't think we've even started to really take it apart. Thank you for this invitation.